Session interesting discussion we had at various places where we talked about how history and contemporary studies talk to each other, and Miguel has kindly agreed to organise this panel. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, basically what we try to do now is to share some challenges we have found in our work when we try to integrate the study of the past and the study of the present. So historical and more contemporary oriented STS perspectives. We are here speakers. I think we come from different backgrounds, also I would say from different generations, so we have experienced the challenges at different points in time. So we'll hopefully offer like a diverse picture of the problem. We very much want your feedback, so we are going to be brief in our presentations. We are going to do them consecutively. And then we'll engage in a discussion in which we encourage you just to share your experiences and the problems you have faced when approaching this, I think, very tricky and difficult problem. So I just hand the stick to Steve Sturdy.
Okay. So this isn't my PowerPoint, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm Steve Sturdy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm currently head of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Probably more by dint of having been around for rather longer than practically anybody else, so not because of any other virtues that I'm aware of. But anyway, most of my work is historical. I do a lot of my research has been on the later 19th and early sort of 20th century history of medicine. And I must confess, I was quite surprised by the title of this session on integrating historical and contemporary perspectives in STS, because I was never really, I think I assumed that it had never sort of become disintegrated in a sense. I always thought that, certainly in my experience, history of science and of medicine were absolutely integral to the development of science and technology studies more generally. And maybe best to take you back to when I started out in the field, which was in the 1980s, doing a PhD in the Science Studies Unit, started in 1982. I'm thinking about what were the sort of big events in the field of science and technology studies, the big publishing events of that period. I mean, in many ways, they were historical case studies, or an awful lot of them were historical case studies. And the big books that came out later in that decade were Leviathan and the Air Pump by Schaefer and Schaffer, and The Pasteurization of France by Bruno Latour. Very different kinds of work, but both very much rooted in historical case studies and doing STS from a historical perspective. And in many ways, I mean, an awful lot of the most exciting work in STS in that period was historical research. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. So in the 1980s, when I joined the Science Studies Unit, the field was really just getting off the ground, if you like, starting to expand and to interact much more than it had done previously with other fields. In the 60s and 70s, the foundations, especially the theoretical foundations of STS, were laid down, among other things, by the Edinburgh group. Bath School as well need to be acknowledged, I think, in this process, and various people in the US. An awful lot of that initial foundational work was really very theoretical, and it came out of a very sort of theoretically promiscuous approach. Roots in the philosophy of science, in epistemology, questions of what knowledge is and what scientific knowledge especially, but drawing on other perspectives, not just from philosophy of science, but from anthropology, the work of Mary Douglas, going back to Evans Pritchard and his work on Lozandi, various different approaches to knowledge that were being brought in and forged into this theoretical perspective, theoretical framework. But there are two sets of sort of questions, if you like. Once you've got that theoretical framework, what do you do with it? And who do you talk to about it? beyond this little group of scholars that's building this framework. And in both cases, historians, and especially historians of science, were absolutely key. So, science studies, science technology studies has roots in philosophy. Philosophers, by and large, weren't interested because they knew what science was. They had a normative approach. They wanted to tell scientists how to do science. We were interested in how scientists actually do science. We wanted to do empirical work, and as far as philosophers were concerned, by and large, that was pretty uninteresting. The only interest would be in how far scientists actually diverge from what they really should be doing, and that was not a particularly interesting question. So philosophers were particularly interested in engaging with this. By and large, social scientists and sociologists weren't terribly interested in engaging with us either, because sociology itself aspired to be a science, and in many ways sociology looked to the philosophy of science for what it should be doing. So anything that wanted to question those normative rules was problematic. Probably the main place in sociology where the main sociological approach to science was coming out of functionalism, out of Merton and other work in that kind of approach, that perspective. And functionalism was no longer interesting. It had been thrown out with an awful lot of so the functionalist approaches to science were thrown out with functionalism more generally, and social scientists didn't particularly want to talk about science. The people who were talking about science were historians of science. And the history of science has a strange institutional history. It developed mostly within, in quite close proximity to science at the time, through the 30s and 40s. As it became institutionalized, it was very much interested in reinforcing the images of science by talking about what scientists actually did and how they made an impact on the world. And they were interested then in how we started to question some of the assumptions that were written into that and the ways that we talked in different ways about science, the way that science was involved in the world. But lots of questions within the history of science itself were relevant to what we wanted to do. So left versus right historians and questions about whether science was more or less shaped by, say, industrial or economic factors were already at play in the history of science, had been since the 1930s, 1940s. Questions about science and the public, for instance. How important were the public and public engagement in the history of science? How did science emerge out of public debates? What's the relationship between science and belief, science and religion, and so on and so on and so on. Science in the Industrial Revolution. How important was science to industry? Was science the driving factor in the Industrial Revolution? Lots of questions that enabled us to engage with good historians about what science actually was, how it worked, where it lived in the world. And the other thing that the history of science offered was a methodology. Historians have a very self-conscious approach to methodology. There's a field of historiography. There isn't a field of philosophography, or so it would be, or of sociography, in the same way that there is a field of historiography. So the ability to engage and talk about method, and to adopt the method that was available among historians of science, and to adapt it to our own ways of doing things, was hugely fertile. And certainly throughout the 80s, most of my engagement was with historians of science, whether they adhered to the sociology of scientific knowledge or to other sociological approaches or not. There was an engagement, there was an interest, and there was a real sort of honing of methods, theories, approaches that came out of that. So for thinking about science and increasingly also of technology, where it fits in the world, how it works, historians were absolutely key interlocutors. And that too, I think to a considerable extent, spilled over into as science studies, science and technology studies became more established, started to engage more widely. It's actually quite striking that even, for instance, when sociologists, many sociologists start to pick up on the strong program, on the Bath School, on different kinds of theoretical approaches, many of them start off by doing historical case studies, because the methods are there and the approaches are there. And Trevor, you've done fair bit of history in your time. People like Lee Starr, Adele Clark, coming out of the Interactionist School. Adele studied with Strauss. People in that kind of area who are interested in doing detailed empirical studies of what science is and how it works, found the historical method absolutely crucial as a way of getting into that. There were sources, there were ways of engaging with sources, there were archives, there were understandings about how you deal with archives. There's a wider community of discourse that people could engage with. So for me, the history of science has been absolutely central to the way that science and technology studies have developed. Many of the methods, many of the approaches have come out of that. And frankly, it really does quite surprise me that that seems to be being forgotten nowadays. I think there wouldn't be a field of science and technology studies as the kind of empirical, sophisticated, detailed empirical approach discipline that it is, had it not been for the history of science. So, I mean, in terms of asking how we integrate historical methods with STS, I mean, I think that they pervade everything we do. Even if we're doing contemporary work, questions about the processes of science, science as a process, questions of innovation, inevitably have a temporal dimension, and that temporal dimension comes from history. So that's my pitch, that's my views on things. I think that was about 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm Miguel Garcia Sancho, and I have started last January as a Chancellor's Fellow in the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies here in Edinburgh. I am a historian by background, and I'm now starting a new project in which I am trying to integrate this background in history of science with more contemporary-oriented methods in STS. So I'm going to share with you some of the challenges I'm facing now. I think maybe my approach is not as optimistic as Steve's one, but I'm going to end up with an optimistic note, so just be patient. And I want to say from the beginning that this is a very personal presentation. I'm just building on my experience, exclusively on my experience. I'm maybe going to do some generalizations, so just bear with me. And bear in mind also that what I'm saying is what I have encountered in my experience. It's not that everything is like that. And the first thing to say is that I think this problem of interdisciplinary integration may be seen from the surface as just a matter of will, a problem depending on will. And I think that's why interdisciplinarity is quite loosely used in political discourses. We have probably all written down the word interdisciplinarity in our funding applications with the hope that after the research is funding, interdisciplinarity will come just quite automatically or quite unproblematically. But my view is that when it comes to the detail, to the day-to-day activity of the researcher, things are much trickier. And I think one of the reasons of this is that history and all the other STS subdisciplines can be seen in two different overlapping ways, which are sometimes confused or conflated. They can be seen as a subject matter when we focus on the object of study, and they can be seen as communities when we focus on the people who practice STS. And I think in the last few years, at least in my experience, at least part of the subject matter of STS has remained pretty stable, while the communities have differentiated and diversified over the time with increasing specialization of STS. So if we look at the subject matter, most of the STS scholars nowadays, or at least since the so-called anthropological turn of STS, when we start looking at empirical case studies, most of the scholars have focused on the dynamic interactions between practices, disciplines, and discourses, and the literature, either the historical literature, the sociological literature, philosophy as well, has engaged very recently in thick descriptions in which they have addressed issues such as how disciplines emerge from laboratory practices, or how both practices and disciplines are mobilized in persuasive discourses with which researchers try to persuade their funders and achieve social and political power. But if we look at the level of the community, I think things are much more diverse, and probably we cannot generalize that much, because there has been an increasing differentiation in both the theoretical and the methodological approach, mainly used by historians and other STS scholars looking at more contemporary issues. If we look at the work of sociologists, anthropologists, or policy scholars, I think we can see that they are mainly concerned with the present. And it is true that they address the past, that they, in some way, they also do historical case studies. But maybe they address the past as an instrument to understand better the present, or even give recommendations about the future of a given field. And for so doing, very recently and very impressively, they have been deploying a series of very sophisticated methods framed in the social sciences, such as ethnography, interviewing, network and discourse analysis, which are very easily applicable to the present, but they are, I think, much trickier and much more problematic when they try to address the past. And almost the opposite applies to historians. They are mainly interested in the past. They are very cautious when they build on the relationship between the past and the present. And their methodologies are more framed in the humanities, in the archives, but in some ways they are not different from the methodologies of the social scientists. It's just a matter of approach. For example, if you take our oral histories, they are a form of interviewing. And if you take our biographies and prosopographies, they are a sort of life story of telling the narrative of a life. But these tools of historiography, they are designed so they can achieve very fine-grained descriptions of the past while remaining deliberately loose about the connections between the past and the present. So I think this increasing differentiation at the level of the community, at the level of the theoretical and methodological frameworks, is one of the reasons why this problem of interdisciplinary integration is maybe much trickier nowadays than before. Because if we look at the work, for example, of Foucault in the 1970s on the archaeology of knowledge, Steve was talking about Leviathan and the Earth Pump, a very celebrated source in the history of science written in the mid-80s, or more recently, Trevor Pinch and other sociologists looking at the social shaping of technology. I think Steve is right that at that time maybe they were not so concerned or feeling themselves as pertaining to different communities. They would even say, for example, I heard a talk by Simon Saffer a few years ago, and he was saying that, well, history and sociology maybe aren't that different, because if you do a historical case study, and this is historical case study is well practiced, you are doing an ethnography as well, and I think vice versa, the opposite applies. But my feeling, and this is a very personal feeling, is that nowadays, most of the attempts at interdisciplinary integration are done at the level of the subject matter, are done by scholars who choose or address a topic of common interest for various STS communities. But this common subject matter is addressed by either one community or the other. So it's addressed maybe by historians interested in STS, but just or mainly using the approaches and the methods of history of science, or by social scientists with an interest in history, but mainly using the methodologies of their own field. And I think this is due to a side effect of a specialization that maybe is not that well designed. And it's that with increasing specialization and community differentiation comes power structures, comes taboos, come practical problems. And maybe if historians and social scientists try to transcend these methodological and theoretical barriers, they will be not very well received by both their communities or the other communities. So, for example, if a historian ever tried nowadays to address the present as carefully as he or she addresses the past, maybe there would be an accusation of Whiggism and teleology, which are like capital sins in history of science. It's trying to address the past by using the standards and the frameworks of the present, and that's not proper history of science. many people would say. And if there were a social scientist trying to address the past as carefully as the present, maybe he or she wouldn't be funded by the ISSTI because the research would be deemed mainly as politically relevant or even dull, not interesting for the current debates in STS. So in order to overcome this problem, I want to propose a collaborative approach to interdisciplinarity in which historians, rather than being in their trenches or in the comfort zone of their communities, of their methodologies, they try to cooperate actively with contemporary STS social scientists, and they propose like joint projects in which they pool their expertise, their theoretical and methodological frameworks, rather than very clumsily historians trying to learn contemporary STS very quickly once an application is funded because they want to be interdisciplinary. And they can also exploit the advantages of the very common subject matter of STS, globally speaking. So I think maybe a good common subject matter in which I have been working in the last few years as a historian, and which is quite well researched here in Edinburgh, is recent biomedicine, because it involves the reconfiguration of practices with the emergence of genetic engineering, big data, bioinformatics. It involves promissory discourses on the potentialities of those new technologies. And it involves new disciplines such as biotechnology and genomics, which at least are presented as substantively different from the previous research on molecular biology. And it also involves a genealogy of narratives in which the accounts of the past, the autobiographies of leading molecular biologists such as James Watson, inform the present and the debates about the future of these new technologies, of the new fields of biotechnology and genomics compared with molecular biology. So in order to do this, I think sources are very important, because sources are the vehicle in which all these diverse communities of STS, all these diverse methodologies and theoretical frameworks can be effectively put together. And I'm just, to finish, going to propose that documents, and particularly all documents, are maybe a good common source to do that. Because on the one hand, they are archival evidence with which historians draw on the past. And on the other hand, they are also artifacts which are enduring influence that goes all the way from the past to the present and informs current social and political debates. If you look, for example, at the talk of Conor Mackenzie yesterday, these undeleted and updated web profiles of the proponents of the accounting software are frozen evidence which is at the same time historical, sociological, and political. So I'm going to just give you a sample of the old documents I've been digging in the archives in the last few months. They are funding applications, they are press releases, correspondence, and meeting minutes. And if they are approaches from a historical perspective, those documents tell you a narrative about the gradual configuration of genomics. But approached from other perspectives, they can also be seen as the bearers of political practice, as the bearer of persuasive discourses, and also of a complex network of actors, for example, at the different attendees of this meeting recorded in a minute, which deploy complex interactions, and sometimes they cooperate and sometimes they compete. So I think these documents can be a very good point of intersection between history and contemporary-oriented STS, and also a means of socialization by which STS scholars maybe are more sensitive about the complexities of the past, and as historians are more sophisticated and especially less boring when we address the connections between the past and the present. So I think all this presentation draws on the very general question of what is a document, and maybe we could finish with the open question of how do you think documents should be approached by STS. And that's all I want to tell you. Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Taylor Spears, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Sociology. And I sort of thought, as the PhD student on this panel, it would probably be best to talk about what I know best, which is just my own research and how I'm trying to integrate these historical and contemporary perspectives in my own research, and maybe this will give you something to think about. The first thing I should say is my work is in this field called the social studies of finance. And while there's a lot of STS-inspired work in the social studies of finance, it would be a mistake to say the social studies of finance is only STS. And so there are other people, for example, anthropologists, who do a lot of work on finance, and historians. And so that's, in some sense, that's kind of shaping my thinking about the contemporary and the historical in this presentation that I'm giving. We'll see if I get to all of this, because there's probably more material here on my research than there's really time to discuss. But I think in the social studies of finance, or really in any social research on finance, this is kind of the catch-22 that we face. Because, you know, in order to understand contemporary financial markets, you really need a knowledge of their history, and, you know, in order to understand how those practices came about. But finance is one of these fields where not very many people know the intricacies of financial market practices unless they work in those markets. And I can say as somebody who's done research, who's doing research on this right now, that it is a major challenge to know what you should do historical research on without knowing kind of about finance in the first place. So what I ended up adopting, you know, when I started my research, I ended up actually going in more of an ethnographic direction. So I really began by doing interviews and, you know, rather than documentary analysis. But what came out of these interviews were a set of historical questions that I'm now looking at and getting more into. And so I think there's a lot to be said for kind of an iterative approach in using multiple sources of data that draw from both contemporary and historical sources. Okay, so I thought I would include a slide here that sort of says why. So I should say my research is on models and modeling practices in finance. And I wanted to sort of explain to you why I find that interesting and important. And I don't know who was at Steve Yearley's talk yesterday, but he made a very interesting point that it was very similar to what I see in finance. One of the things that he said is that there's been a lot of talk about risk, but not a lot of talk about how risk gets measured, or how, I mean in an earth science context, how changes in the environment get measured and what that indicates about risk. And I think that's very true in finance as well. I mean, a lot of the discourses on risk that we see in the social science originated in economics and finance. But there actually hasn't been a lot of social science work on how risk gets measured, and that's ultimately, you know, where it comes from. You know, so in large banks, for instance, the vast majority of assets and liabilities on their balance sheets can only, the fair value, the mark-to-market value of those positions require models to be determined. So, you know, in some cases it's up to 99% of the assets and liabilities on their balance sheet. They require models to ascertain those values. So that's part of the reason that I got very interested in modeling. And the area that I ended up going down for my PhD research is this area called interest rate modeling. The reason I went in that direction is because if you look at contemporary finance, interest rate models are some of the most important in terms of determining the mark-to-market value of balance sheets for accounting purposes. And when I began my research, you know, what was very clear were there were a lot of different users of these types of models. And the one that I ended up focusing most of my attention on were the models that were used by derivative trading desks in large banks. Okay, so I'll skip that for a sec. I wanted to talk a bit about my data because, you know, doing something that combines both contemporary and historical work, you end up using a variety of data sources. And so, you know, me pretending to be an anthropologist, I went to quant conferences, derivative quant conferences, people who work at banks, practitioner workshops. I took a couple of classes on mathematical finance at the Edinburgh Math Department. And I drew a lot on interviews with people who currently work on derivative trading desks, building pricing models and that sort of thing. But another thing that I found very useful were interviewing people who could provide a bit more of a historical perspective, who, were really working 15 or 20 years back and could talk about the original development of that field. And another really important source that I don't feel like anthropologists and people studying contemporary practices use quite as much, but which were really important to me, were documents. So literally hundreds and hundreds of documents put out in trade publications and academic journals, textbooks. All of these were really important for understanding not only kind of what current practices are, but how they sort of changed over time. I thought I should talk a bit about the issues with gaining access, because this is definitely an issue in finance, and I think it's probably an issue in other areas as well. But it might be surprising, but the primary barrier is not really confidentiality or secrecy issues, especially with the area that I studied. It was more sort of penetrating the technical jargon of the field. And so what became very important to me was sort of developing interactional expertise. And then once I had a certain level of interactional expertise, I found that people were quite willing to talk to me. But the nice thing about this, in terms of kind of like reading the historical development of the field, was once you had that interactional expertise and you could talk to people, that actually helped me in terms of analyzing documents for my research as well. Yeah, like I said, I sort of started this as a contemporary-oriented project, just to understand what the practices were. But out of this came what was very interesting to me, this historical question. Because the thing that I noticed was the practices used in derivative markets for interest rate modeling turned out to be very different from what financial economists and other users of these models were doing. And so that sort of got me asking how did this field become separate from financial economics? And that's sort of the direction that I'm moving in now. Okay, I think I have more, but I'm probably close to out of time. I think I'd rather just open it up to questions.
Yeah.
That's all right, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.